Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the one show about business, by business, for business. It doesn't matter whether you look at our history, whether you look at politics, whether you look at public service, or just plain academia. He doesn't need much introduction to people in New Zealand. Dr. Don Brash. And he's here today to discuss a number of the fault lines which are appearing across our community, and particularly about our shared history. But that'll be a little bit later. Now, welcome Dr. Don Brash to Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Thank you.
Before we get into some of the controversial political issues which I know are so interesting in your heart, where did it all start for you?
Wanganui.
So you're a Kiwi, I guess.
Absolutely right, Kiwi. In fact, on my father's side, fifth generation Kiwi, one of my ancestors arrived in the Philip Lang, which was one of the first ships into Dunedin in 1848. So I go way back there. On my mother's side, not quite so long standing a New Zealander, but certainly I regard myself as very much a Kiwi. Yeah.
So is it English heritage?
English and Scottish, both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the tough sinew
is
the Scottish.
That's right.
Formative years?
Wanganui to some extent, no, not so much Wanganui, Christchurch basically. I was brought up, most of my primary school and all my secondary school and all my undergraduate university was in Christchurch.
So you're Canterbury?
Canterbury, I'm a Crusaders fan. That was really when I was formed. I had interesting experience in one sense. I went to Christchurch Boys High, and that was a very militarist school. At that time, the heads of the Army, Navy and Air Force were all old boys of Christchurch Boys High. And after 3 years of doing military cadets, as we did in those days, I opted out of cadets on conscientious grounds. Yeah. And it was a turning point in my life.
That would have been an unpopular thing to do in those
days. It was very unpopular, particularly at that school.
Yes, sure.
And it was a turning point in my life because I very much wanted to go into foreign affairs. And I knew that getting into foreign affairs would be almost impossible as a conscientious objector. So instead of being the average sort of student as I had been to that point, I worked like a galley slave. Mm-hmm. And my marks, which were good average, up to school cert those days, suddenly started getting much better because I had a very strong motivation to get into foreign affairs.
Desire is a big thing.
Absolutely.
Canterbury University?
Canterbury University for BA and MA in history and economics. And then I did a PhD in economics at the Australian National University in Canberra. And that was another significant point because up to that point I'd been very much on the left wing of politics.
All right.
My tutor at Canterbury University was a guy called Wolf Rosenberg, in fact the father of Bill Rosenberg. Okay.
Mine too, yeah.
Lovely guy.
He was he was a member of the Communist Party.
He was. Hell of a nice guy,
yes.
Really nice human being.
Yeah.
And I was never communist, but I was well to the left of the centre.
Yeah.
And I wrote my master's thesis on New Zealand's external debt servicing capacity. Wolf Rosenberg convinced me foreign investment and indeed foreign capital was bad. I went to Canberra intent on doing a much more in-depth study and spent 3 and a bit years studying American corporate investment in Australian manufacturing, starting from the premise that it was bad. It was raping Australia, screwing Australians, and to my astonishment and Wolf Rosenberg's great dismay, I came to the conclusion I'd not just been slightly wrong, but totally wrong. Yes. That most American investment in Australia had been hugely beneficial.
So when did you get into public service?
Well, I went from Canberra to the World Bank in Washington. That was a kind of public service. It's a public sector type institution owned by most of the countries of the world, governments of the world. And I was privileged there to work for a year, or about several years, under the then president of the World Bank, Robert McNamara.
Oh, very famous, ex-Ford executive.
Ex-Ford and ex-Pentagon.
Yeah.
And he was very much in charge of the American effort in Vietnam, and I suspect came to the conclusion that it had been a mistake. And he went to the World Bank in part, I think, to sort of make atonement.
Yeah, because he was very much in favour at the early stages of the war.
He was. I think later came to the realisation
that he made a mistake.
Yeah. So I was lucky enough, he first of all set up what was called the Commission on International Development, chaired by Lester Pearson, former Prime Minister of Canada.
Yes, yes.
And a very small staff, only 12, I was one of them.
So at an early stage you were working with world thinkers, if you like, and world leaders.
That's right. And after finishing that, I was lucky enough to get back to the World Bank in McNamara's staff department, so-called programming and budgeting department. Yeah. Only 8 professionals, I was one of them, and he was an extraordinary man.
And of course, then at some stage you must have got to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand.
Well, yeah, a few things happened between then now and then. I mean, I was asked to come back to run what was then the first overseas affiliated investment bank in New Zealand, namely Broadbank.
Oh, really? So you were in commerce, as you're
Yeah,
saying.
absolutely. For 10 years, I ran a private sector investment bank.
Oh, yeah.
Went from there into chief executive of the Kiwi Fruit Authority, which was
an exporting business.
very early stage.
You've been quite a young man for that job.
When I became chief executive of Broadbank, I was 31. When I became chief executive of the Kiwi Fruit Authority, I was 42.
So it was something of a fast train.
I was very lucky. Very lucky. I mean, I called my autobiography Incredible Luck. Yeah. And I just had a seriously succession of very lucky breaks. Yeah. I did that for 4.5 years at a time when kiwi fruit was growing at a phenomenal rate.
Would you have predicted where it's landed now?
No. I mean, my first year in the industry, New Zealand exported 4.5 million trays of kiwi fruit, and we were the only country in the world producing kiwi fruit commercially. Yeah. This year we produced 145 million trays. Phenomenal. And our production is about 15% of the world total. This has been explosive growth. Yeah. Then I went into being managing director of what was known then as Trust Bank. Older viewers may recall that there were originally 12 trustee savings banks. Government guaranteed their deposits were. The then fourth Labor government, Roger Douglas, said, look, we shouldn't be guaranteeing the deposits in some financial institutions, not others. So you're losing a government guarantee.
Can I interrupt? With the benefit of hindsight, do we lament the loss of those independent institutions now that our banking sector is so dominated by the Australian banks?
The sad thing about that Trust Bank experience was that 11 of the 12 trustee savings banks agreed to merge. TSB remained outside. Sadly, for reasons which I won't go into on air, the chief executive of the ASB Bank decided he did not want to be beholden to a holding company above him. And he pulled ASB out. That was a tragic mistake for New Zealand because ASB, which only operated in Auckland, was too weak without the rest of the country.
Yes.
Trust Bank, without Auckland, was too weak also. So the Trust Bank group without ASB was bought by Westpac. ASB was bought by the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And as you say, an opportunity to create a New Zealand-based full-service bank was lost.
And of course, Kiwi Bank has struggled ever since.
Well, that's right. Kiwi Bank, even though it's government-backed, has had a bit of a struggle. The combined ASB Trust Bank group could, I think, have made a significant impact, but was lost.
So I'd like to now perhaps talk a bit about your experience in banking, particularly as it relates now to the world's having the lowest interest rates in the history of mankind. And whether you think central banks are really up to the task of fixing what is a problem, or they're going to need some help from politicians. It's a big question, I understand that.
How long have we got? I still think central banks do have a vital role to play, but I don't think they're well prepared for that yet. I mean, as you know, there are many parts of the world now where long-term government bond rates are negative. Yeah. I think there's some $13 trillion worth of government bonds which yield a negative rate. I think the German government is issuing 10-year bonds at less than zero. This is an unprecedented period in human history. And
their economy, by the way, is now going backwards.
Well, that's right. And many people say, I think rightly, the German government should be using fiscal policy to prevent that happening. But even within monetary policy, central banks are not well prepared for that because they feel they can't go very far into negative territory before people say, I won't accept that negative rate, I want my money out in cash. Yeah. And at some point, it pays people to have their money in a safe deposit box in physical cash. Yeah. And central banks haven't prepared for that well.
Well, I mean, I think this whole money order needs some serious interrogation because You know, there is this trillions and trillions of liquidity looking for a home, and it's not being invested. It's certainly not being invested in our roads and highways.
No.
Which brings me to our situation here in New Zealand, where we flatlined productivity for as long as, and I've had a number of speakers on this show, and tried to give prescriptions for fixing our flatlining productivity. What might be yours?
Well, I owe my view to the opinions of a guy called Michael Riddell, who was a very smart economist at the Reserve Bank throughout my time as governor there for 14 years, and was there throughout Alan Ballard's reign, and was made redundant by Graham Wheeler. His view is, surprisingly, and many of your viewers won't be enthusiastic about this view, is that we've had a rate of immigration which has been very high for a country of our size.
Yes.
And we have a low Anglo-Saxon saving rate, but with a high population growth driven by immigration means we have to spend most of our available savings, what economists call capital widening, rather than capital deepening.
Yes.
In other words, more houses, more roads, more schools, more hospitals, not
productive
more,
enterprise.
Not more capital per worker.
Yeah.
And that, he thinks, is one of the major reasons why business investment in New Zealand has been quite low. Our interest rates have also, because of that pressure between savings and investment, been fractionally higher than interest rates internationally for comparable inflation rates. What does that mean? The exchange rate's overvalued. Persistently, not just briefly, but persistently. So what investment does take place has tended to be in domestic sectors of the economy, not in the export sector.
Houses.
Well, that's right. But export sector is where you tend internationally to get the best productivity growth. That's been true in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But our export sector, for a country of our size, is very small. It's not big at all. We think of it as big, but it's not big. When National came into government in 2008, they made a commitment to raise the export sector as a share of GDP from 30 to 40%.
They failed.
It's now 27%. It's lower now than it was in 2008. And that's, as I say, partly because there's been a persistent overvaluation of the exchange rate, and in Riddell's view, that's partly because we've had this very high population growth rate.
Well, by the way, mind you, everyone for a while said, well, New Zealand's population is shrinking, we're aging, so we need a young, fertile injection. And of course, what's kept, I think, costs and inflation low around the world is this huge pool of skilled and qualified labour who are prepared to work for relatively low wages. And you can see that now to China, there's production moving into even lower wage countries than China, which you know is problematical if you're making things. The problem is, how do we therefore fix the capital intensity, which is has been a big problem for years?
Yeah, well, in Michael Riddell's view, we should have a lower rate of immigration. I'm not talking about the kind of people coming in at all, just talking about the rate. The population growth rate driven by that immigration level, which is, he says, is the highest rate of immigration of any developed country in the world except Israel. Israel has a higher.
But what do you say to the people who can't build their skyscrapers and
enough
brickies and everything else?
But when people come in from offshore, their demand for things, including housing and buildings, is greater than they initially supply in terms of labour.
So there's a deficit.
That's right. So actually scaling back immigration would actually take pressure off the labour market.
It actually makes some sense.
It does. It does. Yeah.
Well, we need to do something. I think we need to break the cycle. I mean, in contrast that, we've got polytechs and so on who are going broke because they haven't got enough people in them to make them work. International
productivity has been going down in recent years, generally. Our productivity rate has been lower than most other developed countries for decades. And as a consequence, whereas we used to have one of the highest standards of living in the world, we don't any longer.
Okay, so I mean, that's a very interesting idea. How about our education system?
Well, that's again another headache. Too many kids coming out of school unable to read and write properly. We're big on culture and all this sort of stuff in our schools. But we do our kids no favour at all by having them come out of high school even, barely able to read and write. I think one of the saddest things about this current government is the way they scrapped what appeared to have been an extremely successful educational experiment, namely charter school.
It was ideological.
That's right. And the sad, I mean, guy like Kelvin Davis, who himself, of course, has Maori background,
Yeah.
deputy leader of Labour, said in advance of the election he would resign from Parliament if charter schools were scrapped.
Well, unfortunately, what happens, politics overtakes people's principles a lot of the time, as you probably would have observed.
Too often, yeah.
In our national discourse, is the spectre of racism overbearing and silencing many discussions that we need to have? Would you like to help me define what racism actually is?
Well, I think racism is a view of the world which regards some races as inherently superior to other races, or some races inherently inferior to other races. And that to me is racism. And it's particularly pernicious when that is built into law or practice.
Yeah.
And I think New Zealand has traditionally regarded itself as free of racism.
Yeah.
We regarded everybody as good as everybody else, irrespective of the colour of their skin. Sadly, I think that's disappearing.
Well, I mean, racism seems to me, in the way our national discourse is developed, is only practiced by white people.
Well, that's right. That's right.
Doesn't seem to be practiced by
anyone
people
else.
of colour. No.
That's right. Almost by definition, in New Zealand these days, you cannot be racist if you are any colour except white.
Yeah.
And I'm accused routinely of being racist, and I not only don't like that, I bitterly resent it.
Yeah.
It is a total nonsense. I mean, apparently I was called up by someone, a journalist the other day, who said that a local body person, local government person in Wellington actually, had been embarrassed because we had, at Hobson's Pledge, had categorised him as someone who was opposed to special racial privilege. And he was embarrassed about that. I said, aren't you, the journalist said to me, isn't it racist what you're saying? I said, on the contrary, the people who are racist are people who want different treatment for people based on their ancestry. That's the racism.
Is it, I mean, when we go back to our whatever founding documents there are, because we don't really have founding fathers as such, I would have thought all the signers of the Treaty of Waitangi, and certainly all the Europeans that came to visit and live in New Zealand, would hope for a unified nation with shared goals and values. Is that
well, I mean, that's right. And the reason why we call our organisation Hobson's Pledge is that Governor Hobson, in signing the Treaty of Waitangi and having Maori chiefs sign that, said as each Maori chief signed it in Maori, we are now one people. So there's not much doubt about what the vision was.
Is there any disagreement with that statement?
No. The fact that Hobson said that is, I think, uncontested. The fact that Article 3 of the treaty says all the New Zealanders have the rights and privileges of British subjects is as clear as the nose on your face. But somehow we've reinterpreted the treaty, and people now say, well, Maori didn't really cede sovereignty, they were really in partnership with the Crown. Now, apart from the constitutional impossibility of the Crown being in partnership with its subjects, the idea has been regarded as absurd by politicians as different as Jim McLeod, David Longy and Winston Peters. They said it's absurd to suggest there was a partnership between Maori chiefs and the Crown created.
Is there a certain amount of, let's call it adventurism on the part of clever advocate lawyers who see an ongoing grievance gravy train here?
Well, that's my personal view. I mean, to say that, of course, is to criticise the objectivity of the judiciary. But I think the appeal court did us a great disservice by using the term partnership in the 1987 judgment. And partnership, of course, can be simply a general comment about being friendly together, but it's been built into a framework where it says that Maori should have equal status with the Crown. And Kelvin Davis, of course, the Minister for Crown Maori Relations, had a series of hui around the country in 2018, in which he found a lot of Maori were unhappy because the Crown was making decisions without getting approval from Maori. Well, to me, that is nonsense. The Crown doesn't need approval from any of its subjects to make decisions. And we do our country a great disservice by pretending that that's...
But of course, Maori are now very well represented in government anyway, aren't they?
Well, in Parliament, 30 MPs, 25% of the total, claim Maori ancestry, which is higher proportion of Parliament than it is of the general population. And that's great. But, I mean, we argue there's no longer any justification for having separate Maori electorates. They were put in place for a very good reason back in 1867 when only men who owned property got to vote, Maori property being communally owned. Maori men didn't get a vote, so they were created to enable Maori men to vote.
But all that's changed.
It's all that's changed. And indeed the Royal Commission, which recommended we adopt MMP back in 1986, they recommended, and we did it of course in 1996, they said if we adopt MMP, the logic for having Maori seats no longer exists. And of course it doesn't any longer exist.
Don, you've had a long career in public service, running the bank, of course, and then had a rush of blood to the head and got into politics. If you wish to comment on that, by all means do so, but I don't blame you if you don't. But having had that experience, you've seen how the public discourse can be quite fickle. We've got a couple of fault lines sitting, as one is this land in Manukau, at the airport, where it's now being occupied by people, and there's a whole lot of issues sit under that. And we also have had the 250-year Cook celebrations, both of which seem to be kind of interesting interpretations of what really, probably the facts on the land, and everyone sort of, it seems almost toxic that decision makers are trying to avoid. But can we put those two separate things into some kind of historical context? What is really going on in Manukau?
Manukau, I'm not an expert in, but as I understand it, the government negotiated with a local tribe, there was a treaty of settlement, there was payment of cash, and the land was freeholded and bought by Fletcher Building.
With some historical protections in there.
Yeah, that's right. And apology, cash paid, etc. I think for the government to unwind that deal in any way at all would be very detrimental to the whole treaty settlement process, which incidentally I support. I don't doubt that there were some bad things done historically. Some shortcuts were taken and some tribes were disadvantaged by that process. So I favour the treaty settlement process. And one of the things that I think the last national government did very well indeed was they accelerated the process of settling those treaty grievances. Because as long as it drags on, Maori feel that their prosperity will finally arrive when they get a check from the Crown,
well, these
and it
days
won't be.
It doesn't seem to be any more the government's reticence. It's mandates within the iwi themselves.
That's correct. That's right.
Those are political issues that need to be resolved. I think most people recognise that.
But the national government, to their credit, accelerated that process very substantially. I think they made some mistakes. I think the Marine and Coastal Area Act was a disaster, but accelerating the process was a good thing to do. And the Manukau issue was one where they dealt with that and it's resolved, and Fletcher Building should be allowed to get about its business.
What do you do about the young people and old that have decided they don't like that decision of camped out there? We don't want to see what happened to Bastion Point again.
Not if we can avoid it.
But Bastion Point was a different set of circumstances.
It was a different set of circumstances. But go to the James Cook thing. I mean, I think that has been an appalling situation. For Maori to claim that the arrival of Europeans has been a net negative for Maori is clearly a nonsense. I mean, everyone who's looked at New Zealand history knows that pre-European settlement in New Zealand, Maori had no written language, they had no use of metals at all. They were basically, say Stone Age implies a derogative.
That's what it was, though.
But it was. Cannibalism was widespread, infanticide was widespread. Colonialism brought some bad things, but on balance, it was hugely beneficial to Maori people.
Well, what slightly offends me about these recent celebrations is to try and characterise Captain Cook as a rapacious, greedy coloniser. He was actually on, as near as I can tell, and I've read a lot about this, he was on a scientific mission.
He was.
And of course in those days, anyone that got to new lands, they planted their flag. That is, by the way, happening to this day. We've got the Russians who've got a flag under the North Pole on the sea bottom. So we've got that in Antarctica, of course, the same story. So that hasn't, that's still going on around the world. But how do you feel about that?
Again, I think it's very tragic. It's very clear from Cook's diary and the diary of Joseph Banks, who's on that vessel with him, that Maori were shot. but they were very regrettably, they were very sad about that.
Yeah, they were, yes.
That wasn't something they welcomed or celebrated at all. They were very embarrassed about it because they were under instructions from London to treat with, quote, native people
Yes.
Generously and kindly. So they were very uncomfortable with the fact that people had been shot in self-defense. I mean, nothing as much as talked about the other incidents where Europeans arrived in New Zealand and were frankly murdered in significant numbers by Maori. So I think and
of course, it's true to say that the tribes themselves were not at ease up and down the country.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. We know that pre-1840, the so-called musket wars resulted in huge loss of life. Yeah. Anything between 20 and 40,000, estimates vary. Yeah. But more people were lost in the musket wars pre-1840 than New Zealand lost in the entire First World War. And that was regarded as a calamitous event. So European settlement, on balance, has to be regarded as enormously beneficial to Maori. And for Maori to claim it's been a disaster, I just think is dishonest.
Well, in these most recent celebrations, and there were some people wanting to take Captain Cook's statue down. Yeah. Do you agree with that?
No, of course I don't. I mean, it's just appalling. And Hobson's Pledge issued a press statement deploring the fact the British High Commission went to Gisborne and sort of expressed regret for what had happened. Well, I mean, I think that was just totally inappropriate. Mm.
If you were to give Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern a shopping list of things to do in her next term of office, which she may or may not actually enjoy, to make sure New Zealand is more prosperous, what would be on it?
Well, as I say, I would be inclined to scale back the immigration level. Fixing the Resource Management Act is another very high priority, and I'm working with a very top lawyer trying to work out a draft to do exactly that. But the third thing I'd look at is not directly related to economic growth, but to the social stresses in New Zealand, and that's the price of housing. I mean, the median house price in Auckland now is 9 times the median household income. Now, when I was growing up, the median house price in Auckland was 3 times the median household income.
3 times worse off.
It's got 3 times worse off. Yeah. People say, well, it was always tough to get a house, and you know, young people should cut out the flat whites and all that sort of stuff. They're dreaming. They don't understand the price of houses has gone up, not just in absolute terms, but relative to incomes, hugely. And that's a direct consequence of a policy failure. The Labour government, when it came into office in 2017, had in its speech from the throne a commitment to scrap the urban boundary around Auckland, because it's the urban boundary around Auckland which pushes up the price. Yeah. If you're paying $800,000 for 400 square metres in Flatbush, not in Epsom, but in Flatbush, you cannot put an affordable house on it. You put a tent on that and you still can't afford it. So until you get the price of land down, you won't have affordable housing in New Zealand.
Don, I'm afraid we could talk all day, but I do want to thank you for your forthright candour, and would encourage you to continue on making New Zealand a fairer, more open place to live. So thank you for being with us on Business at the Speed of Coffee.